Hi there, and welcome to my presentation on drenching on New Zealand farms. First of all, we're going to do an overview of the presentation. This is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. We'll look at drench resistance today and what that means to you. Then I'll show you some case study farms that I've been visiting and some problems that I've found that farmers have had, or maybe not known they've had, about their drenching programs. Then we'll move on to environmental and financial sustainability. After this, I'll talk about drench reduction, using the right type of drench and when to drench. Moving on to feed and grazing management, and finally the choice of stock on your property. So first of all, what is drench resistance? Drench resistance is when previously susceptible worms that would have been killed will survive a correctly applied standard dose of anthelmintic or drench. These resistant worms will breed and pass on their resistance to the next generation. So as drenching continues, non-resistant worms will be continued to be killed and resistant worms will survive. Therefore, the population of resident resistant worms on your farm will increase. Unfortunately, resistance is usually permanent. This means to you that there could be a major production loss, especially in commercial farms, and overall general health of poor health of your stock. This is also a problem on livestock properties as well, and this means a loss of income and money. So the first farm that I visited was a small alpaca farm, a breeding farm run by a couple. They did do fecal egg counts every 6 months, but no drench resistant tests. They consulted their vet about drench use, when to drench and what kind of drench to use. They actually tried a few and settled on the most expensive, as they found the others, they actually had a few deaths through worms on the other quality drenches, so decided to stick with the most expensive as they found that worked best for them. They rotated their stock on the pasture every 4 to 6 weeks. They estimated the weight of their animals to get the drench dose. They were concerned about breeding considerations for the future, but this was not something that they actively practiced now. They also consulted their vet on any health concerns they had with their animals before just jumping in and drenching them. And lastly, they did drench all their stock. Excuse me. The second farm was a large dairy farm with a rotary shed. The manager got advice from their vet on how, when and what to drench. They too blanket drenched all their stock. They had a set routine of time of year to drench, and they had a grazing management program for their young stock. Unfortunately, there was no breeding or financial or environmental considerations regarding their worm management that I could find. Moving on to the last farm I visited, which was another dairy farm, but a smaller shed. This couple did consider their stock activity, their health, what time of year it was, what the stock were looking like and what they were doing before they drenched them. They did consult with their vet about what to use, and they had a routine schedule and choice of drench. They weighed their stock to get an accurate weight for the dosing, and they also had a grazing management program on the farm and also sent some of their stock away to Blenheim to be grazed. They were willing to invest on worm management, as they basically said that it saved them money in the long run. So problems that I found from visiting these 3 farms were that they blanket drenched all their stock. They didn't consider which animals needed to be drenched or not needed to be drenched. There was no testing for anthelmintic resistance or fecal egg counts a lot of the time. This would have provided them with an idea of which animals had a high worm burden or if the drenches weren't being effective, both of which can lead to drench resistance if the drench isn't working. They used the same drench time and time again. They didn't change if it wasn't being effective, and they estimated their animals' weights, which again gives an inaccurate dose for them, which can lead to drench resistance. So thinking about now environmental and financial sustainability. Accelerating worm resistance on New Zealand farms means that current worm control management policies are not going to be sustainable. What does this mean for you? Well, if a sound drenching plan is not in place or it's not effective, then you are wasting your time and your money. Drench resistance is a production cost that you may not be aware of until there's a long-term drench failure, by which time clinical signs are seen. The weight gain in your young stock, milk production might be down, but studies actually do show that cows exposed to worms spend less time grazing and ruminating and more time in idling behaviour. And these infectious animals showed less milk production, weight gain and body condition. However, none of these cows in the study showed any clinical signs. So as you can see, you need to take action before clinical signs are seen. So thinking about reducing your use of drench, it may sound a little bit silly, but it's quite important. A few of the tools that you can use to reduce resistance are refugia. Now, refugia is ensuring that there will always be some drench susceptible worms, so worms that can be killed by the drench, that are available to breed and maintain in the active population. These susceptible worms, will dilute the drench resistance. As my diagram shows, the first herd have all been treated and the susceptible worms have died, the ones in blue, so you're only left with the resistant worms. Whereas in the second picture, only half the herd was treated, so some of the susceptible worms have survived. So as the diagram shows, to do this, to make a refugia, simply don't drench all your mob. Ask yourself, do you really need to drench all your animals? Do you need to drench your healthy animals? Can they survive without a drench? Will they have a good quality of life and will they have a good production if they're not drenched? You can also put your undrenched healthiest adult animals on pasture previously grazed by young stock to dilute the resistant population. A study by Meat and Wool New Zealand showed that leaving about 10 to 20% of lambs undrenched can lower the level of drench resistance in the worms on your pasture compared to those animals that have been drenched. Another tool to use is spelling your paddocks, so resting them for at least 3+ months to be effective. So rest them and the direct sunlight will dry out and kill some of the eggs and larvae. Keep your pasture length long. Most larvae live in the bottom 2 centimetres of pasture. So it makes sense to have a longer pasture for your stock to eat to prevent them ingesting the larvae. Think about your pasture species. Think about sowing tannin-rich pasture, which studies have shown may decrease larval establishment. Sow fodder crops or new pasture, and these will be free of worm eggs and larvae. And finally, drench test. Test how effective your drench is. Are the worms being killed or is there some resistance showing up? If there is resistance, change your drench family, as continuing to use ineffective drench carries a higher risk of drench resistance developing in your herd. Moving on now to drench. using the right drench, drenching at the right time, and using the right dose. So how do we do this? Choosing the right time. Ask yourself which animals need drenching. Choose your most susceptible stock, susceptible to worm burden. This will usually be your young growing stock, as these are most susceptible to worms, and therefore your production loss is going to be the most important thing to focus on with these animals. Their immunity is yet to develop. They say by about 18 to 20 months for cattle and 8 to 9 months for sheep it should be mature. So when they're young, they will be shedding more eggs onto the pasture than mature animals. Also, lambing, calving and lactation are all stressful times for your stock, and this can see falls in the animal's immunity, which can lead to higher worm burdens and higher fecal egg outputs. So consider a worm management plan to reduce the worm challenge for all these animals on your farm, as well as for your rams and bulls before mating. Monitor your stock. If you see clinical signs, your worm management program has probably not been working for a while and you're potentially losing money. So weigh your stock often, check them. Do they look healthy? Perform fecal egg counts and drench tests regularly. The fecal egg count will give you an indication of the worm burden of your stock and is a really simple, quick and easy test to do. Choose the right drench. So drench test your stock to see if the drench is being effective against the particular worms on your farm. If not, move on to another drench family. Choose another product for drench. Speak to your vet or rep if you need to, if you're unsure of how to do this, as if you continue to use the same ineffective drench, you're simply increasing the chances of resistance developing on your farm. And choose the best drench for your stock. Speak to your vet, as I've just said. Ensure it's suitable for the age range and species you have. If you're showing a few signs of resistance, my advice from speaking to many vets and farm reps would be to use a combination drench, which means many families all together. Excuse me, as this is likely to kill more worms than a single action drench is. Choose the right dose, and drench to the heaviest animal. To do this, you need to accurately weigh your animals to ensure you're giving them the right dose. Underdosing or overdosing is another way to build up resistance. Maintain your drench equipment. Wash your gun after each use, lubricate the washers, and get serviced if necessary. Looking after your drenching equipment will ensure you're accurately drenching, and it will probably save you time when you're drenching as well. Use the correct technique. Go on YouTube to look at a video or ask your vet or farm rep to demonstrate if you're unsure. Using the correct technique will ensure you don't waste any drench and that you're not underdosing. And finally, use your drench as part of your whole worm management program on your farm. Moving on to grazing and feed management. So this is relevant to commercial and lifestyle blocks. So as I said before, most larvae is found in the first 2 centimetres of pasture height. Therefore, if you're overstocking and overgrazing, which means grazing to the last 2 centimetres of pasture, and also giving no supplement support to your stock, you're going to expose your animals to a high level of larval intake compared to those animals that are lightly grazing over the same area or a larger area. Consider spreading your manure over the paddocks. Manure piles do encourage larvae to survive as they're nice, warm, moist areas. So it's important to remove or spread the dung to maximise the dry out and death of eggs and larvae in them. This is particularly important in spring and autumn when larval numbers on the pasture are at their highest. Finally, good nutrition and mineral levels are going to ensure that your animals are less stressed, in good condition, higher immunity, and less likely to release eggs onto the pasture and have a high worm burden. Finally, pleased to know we're moving on to the choice of stock on your property. So if you can, and I know it's not always possible, cross graze your paddocks. Around 4 to 16 weeks I've found is a good idea to do, using old and young stock, as young stock are the main source of pasture contamination in their first year, and then older animals going in after them are more resistant and can be used to reduce the numbers of infective larvae on the pasture by being used as a vacuum. You can use cross species, so sheep and cattle and horses, for example, as the worms are usually host specific, so they won't infect other species of animals. Think about your stocking rate, as obviously the higher your stocking rate, the higher the potential for worm problems, as there'll be more worms shed onto the pasture. Quarantine drenching is really important when you're bringing new stock onto your property. Quarantine drench all your stock, as you don't know their worm status and they could potentially bring new resistant worms onto your property. And then perform a drench check 10 days later to ensure that the drench you're using is suitable for them. Consider culling and breeding programs. So cull any susceptible animals in your breeding program to provide more hardy genes to come through and therefore a higher immunity. You can also breed for more resistance for worms. So in summary, what have I been talking about to you tonight? Drench resistance is usually permanent. So by having a worm management plan and working in collaboration with your vet and or rep to minimise your stock exposure to worms at critical times, your production may be increased, which is great. So by the time you do see clinical signs, your worm management program has probably not been working for some time and you will be losing money. So you do need to work on your worm management plan. Drench if necessary. Think about your stock health and why you are drenching. Your goal is to reduce the worm burden but not develop resistance on your farm. Always determine the cause of your stock health problem. Don't assume it's worms before drenching, as they may not be the problem. And remember, 85 to 95% of your worm population is found on the pasture. So just killing worms on your stock is only part of your overall strategy to minimise exposure at critical times. If you have any other questions about drenching or worm management plans, please contact your vet for advice. They are here to help. Okay, thank you.